Good morning, everybody. Sorry for delaying the start of this meeting. Councilors, please may I have your attention? We had to attend to some housekeeping business this morning that was unavoidable. We apologize for that, but here we are. Thank you for our guests, members of the public, staff, and video watching participants on a date to be determined. Anyway, welcome everyone. I do have an apology from Fenton, who is out of town on other business, and Debbie, I believe you're leaving midday or so, is that? Okay. Any other notices, apologies?
I'd like to move that the apologies be received, Chair.
Thank you. A seconder? Thank you. All those in favor?
Need to leave by 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Okay. Carried. Any conflict of interest declarations for the day?
Just for the day?
Just for the day?
All right, no, that's
None for the day. Okay, thank you. Confirmation of minutes. So we just go through these for accuracy. Page 2, we begin on page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Any concerns, comments on any of the above?
Just an observation, Chair. Could I suggest that for future meetings that if any councillor has an issue with the minutes, that they be forwarded to the Chair for resolution prior to the meeting, that rather than go through them each page after page, we can simply take the minutes as read and amended if that is an issue, and just simply do as one resolution. We'll save ourselves some time.
It would make sense to me. How do others feel about that?
Well, the only thing is that there may be contention on a matter like that, so you couldn't just take advice from someone and that's it.
So perhaps it would
Have
fall
to
to
be
the
dealt
chair
with
to
at the meeting.
identify, here are the issues that have been raised with the minutes, otherwise.
But if there
We can
was an issue being raised about the draft minutes, I'm sure the person sending the note to say there is such and such would CC in all the other councillors, and so we'd have plain view of it. If there was no contention, well then just move the minutes.
Okay. I didn't hear any concerns with these minutes on their accuracy. Are there any matters arising from them? And if not, would somebody move to accept them?
Happy to move, Mr. Chair.
All those in favor?
That's 5 minutes.
All right, there we are. We're on to follow-ups. Well, I guess before we move further, I am going to ask, once we get past maybe 4 and 5 here, for Ian Maxwell to give us an update on the staff's reactions, thoughts about the Board of Inquiry findings to date and the report given, and what's going on to begin to address some of the issues raised by that. So we'll do that before we move on to items, the decision items later on the agenda here. So, but
Point of order, Mr. Chair, is this an additional item to the agenda? Would it be prudent to call for items of business not on the agenda and include this one in it?
it just depends on how procedurally complicated you want to make things. I just want Mr. Maxwell to give us a report.
Sure.
I don't care how he does it.
All right. Well, Mr. Chair, if you allow me to move to item 5, can I ask for 2 items of urgent business? The first being the Havelock North Water Inquiry, some sort of response,
Okay,
and the second is the contamination incident in the Ahuriri estuary. So 2 items of urgent business.
that's acceptable to me. How do other councillors feel? We need
So,
your agreement to do that?
Is it urgent business or minor items for discussion only?
What's your,
Well, I suggest we try to resolve this earlier, but I'm suggesting they are urgent items and we're having discussion, but obviously no resolutions.
I think the inquiry I would treat as an urgent item. Is there any objection, though, to treating both that way? All right, well,
None
let's
at
do,
all.
Well, I would be absolutely loath to put the Havelock North water inquiry down under this council's heading as a minor item.
that's, okay, we are not doing that.
I'm going to be protest to the nth degree on that.
All right.
It's not a minor item, it's an urgent item.
It's an urgent item. So
And
are we
similarly
all
for
squared
the-
away? Is everybody happy with the, okay. So let's go back to item 4 here, which we do have some follow-up items. And Ian, a couple of those belong to you and one to Graham. So, Ian?
Yes, through you, Chair. So number 1, there's a paper later in the agenda for discussion around feedlots. And I'll just deal with number 3, and Mr Hentz, I'm sure, can talk to number 2. The field trip. So I've had some preliminary discussions with the chair of the committee, and we've got an idea in mind in terms of what we want to do, and I'm just trying to resolve dates between the various participants, but it's likely to be in July rather than June. So the plan is to look at Central Hawke's Bay wastewater ponds, feedlot operation or feedlot operations midwinter, and also to have a discussion with NIWA scientists who have completed an MB funded project looking at impacts on the Tuki. So combine a whole lot of things.
Riverbed Gravel Management Review, 9 submissions were received by the closing date associated with the Riverbed Gravel Management Plan and the Environmental Code of Practice that have been coupled up as part of the a special consultative process. There were 9 submissions received, of which are broadly split into 2 in support of associated primarily with gravel extractors, and 7 have raised a number of points, of which 1 relating to fish and game has a level of substance that we feel we need to make further progress on. We believe all the issues are probably resolvable through either a collective or individual meeting process as opposed to a formal hearing at the moment, but we were keen to go through a round of that negotiation and determine where we go from there. Mr Maxwell's offered to be involved in the fish and game element before he takes leave as the one that has the, I suppose, the greatest level of content or substance. A number of the others were really either not focused on the submission or comments with a significant focus on the Tuki aggradation issue. So it's related to, but a fair degree of commentary around what we're going to do in that space.
So could we assume that if any material conflict emerges, that would come back for our attention at some point?
That would be the expectation, that we will. We're just assessing those submissions at the moment. We've summarised them into a sort of support or wish to be heard basis. There's 3 of those that wish to be heard, and we think a meeting with them, as I say, either individually or collectively initially, will give us some direction as to the further level of formality.
Thank you, Chair. So the inquiry released the stage 1 report last week. I have circulated a link or a copy to the link for the report to you all, and I'm I'm not assuming that you've all read it, but I'm assuming that in detail, but I'm assuming you've had a look through it. Staff have subsequently worked through an analysis of stage 1 to try and pick out the key themes or elements, recognising that stage 1 is not about recommendations, of course, so stage 1 doesn't make any particular recommendations but just sets out the views of the inquiry based on the hearings they've had, the 2 hearings, one in December and one in January, February, and it pulls out the key areas of fault or failing within the organisations who have responsibility for elements of drinking water supply in the overall framework. So the analysis, and I'm not proposing to go through that, excuse me, in detail with you, sets out broadly the key or the salient points from the report. What I will do though is, and I'm obviously happy to take questions on any of this, I think for expediency, I think that's probably most of the discussion will lay. What I'm going to do is just highlight for you that what we see as the 4 key areas that have been identified, to go into a little bit more detail of section 6 of the analysis, which sets out what you could consider our recommendations, albeit, like I say, they're not worded as such, and then to explain to you what we have either done or have been doing, because we haven't been waiting for stage 1 to come to us. We've been through the course of or journey of this inquiry. Things have been revealed that needed to have been addressed or dealt with that we have been doing, and some things that we will seek clarification of through stage 2, or some things that will take a bit longer, but I'll explain those to you shortly. So if I go to the 4 key areas that the inquiry focused on, and perhaps just before I do, I'd say the inquiry report didn't present to us, if you like, any surprises, so any things that we weren't aware of through the journey, so the inquiry hasn't presented new information or material that we weren't aware of through either the hearings process or through the submission from the counsel assisting the inquiry, Nathan Getty. So the 4 key areas that focus or are particularly relevant to us are around our consenting activities and how we consent these water takes in future. And like I say, these are not recommendations, but they are an indication of perhaps where the inquiry sees the deficiencies and where things may need to change, and those are things that will need to be explored further. Application of the National Environment Standard for Drinking Water Supply, albeit that I note the board or the inquiry noted that strong criticism of us wasn't warranted, but as I've said, we were doing it in substance, but the policy or the procedures or the processes weren't clear. So that's an area of failing. Our compliance monitoring of the bores and the conditions associated with the bores, and our broad state of the environment monitoring and reporting. So those are the 4 key areas for us. And then in the email that I sent to you yesterday, I've fleshed out a little bit in terms of the section 6 matters in the analysis, which are more about what you might consider being recommendations, and a little bit of commentary around that, because I was expecting that you would want to know what have we done and what are we doing, or what do we propose to do about these things. So I'll just work through them all briefly so that you understand clearly what's in there. So the first one being our state of the environment monitoring. So we're and this was something that is not a surprise to us. So we are in the process at the moment of a region-wide review of our state of the environment monitoring network. So we're going to the market for a person to come in at arm's length and review our network across all of our domains, not just groundwater, but all of our domains, to advise us on whether they're still fit for purpose. In the process of doing that, we will specifically engage with the drinking water suppliers and have conversations with them about the groundwater or any of the water-related monitoring let's not narrow it down. Any of the water-related monitoring, most likely focused on groundwater, to see if our monitoring networks can be modified or revised or expanded to include monitoring that would be of benefit not just to our role as having a wide or broad understanding of the state and trends of things like groundwater, but whether it can provide information specific and relevant to individual bores and water takes in a water supply network. So we'll have that conversation. B in the email is our consenting, and this is an area that is a reasonably significant element for us. In essence, the inquiries found that in consenting the takes in 2008, we should have had regard for, and I'm putting this very simply, the effect of the activity on itself, i.e. we should have had some understanding of the effect of operating those bores on drawdown or the potential drawdown of surface water from the likes of the Mangatiri stream. Not only that having an impact on itself, but also a localised impact on groundwater, i.e. by drawing surface water down under the action of pumping it into the bores, it contaminates, albeit at a very localised and small scale, groundwater. And in the inquiry's view, that engages the Resource Management Act, and we have a role and an obligation there. So from a staff perspective, we're saying that represents a significant practice change for the sector. It's not something the sector does at the moment. We're not arguing that it shouldn't, but we're saying that's not what happens anywhere. And it has significant potential impacts on the way we obviously operate resource consent in the future. If that practice or that process is followed through for every water take, not just drinking water supply bores, because potential irrigation bores can have the same effect, albeit localised, then it's likely to involve significantly greater costs for applicants, because they're all going to require fairly extensive and detailed scientific investigations and possibly things like tracer dye tests, and it may well result in many applications being recommended for decline. So we need to work through in stage 2 how that would work in practice, and whether the RMA intended that, whether the lawmakers expected that, whether that's the outcome that the RMA process is expected to or anticipates providing. Because obviously, like I say, it's quite a big step change. It's something that we'll be looking to explore pretty thoroughly through stage 2, because out of stage 2 do come recommendations, and if a recommendation comes out of it that is very specific about this, we would want to have the inquiry understand the application or the practicalities of that and what it means in practice if those sorts of things are put in place. The third element is the National Environment Standard, and I mentioned earlier that they noted strong criticism wasn't warranted, but nonetheless there are things that we failed in that we can do better in, and again we haven't waited for that. We identified that early on in the process, and we have already updated our process mapping, so our process mapping tools, which are the tools the consent planners use to methodically work through consent applications, to absolutely bring to the front the National Environment Standard for drinking water. We've also revised all of our templates and forms to make the National Environment Standard for drinking water front and centre for any application for water takes. So it's now something that is has far more prominence than it had in the past through our processes and templates. There is also a question that sits in the NES, which is relevant to the consenting, that excuse me, an application should be considered for the effects on itself. Should it be considered upstream of itself and therefore recommended for decline if it's known to be drawing in contamination? So the NES is also engaged in that consenting element that I just talked about earlier. So that's another. So the way that those all come together and how they relate is something that we need to get some clarification on through stage 2. The fourth item is the use of clauses around the condition of boreheads, so condition 21, and there are other conditions that we have which are generic conditions in all our consents requiring wellhead security and compliance with well integrity matters. In the inquiry's view, what we had done by having a generic clause isn't good enough. It's not okay. So we need to work through what that means, and we've already engaged in discussions with bodies like Irrigation New Zealand, who obviously have a significant interest in this, about ways that we could resolve that, because it's to an element, to a certain extent, in many cases it might be time, place, circumstance specific, i.e. we may look at devising or plagiarising existing risk matrices which bring together things like the end use of the water, the location, the depth, the construction method of the bores, to devise not a generic condition but a set of conditions that you could pick from a pick list relevant to the bore and its location. So that's an area that we're working on as well. And we don't propose to do that in isolation of the broader regional sector, because our understanding is that the conditions we have are conditions that are used reasonably widely again throughout the sector. So it's an issue for regional councils generally. So it makes sense that we would do that as a sector to figure that out, rather than us having something for Hawke's Bay that was a lower standard than others were applying elsewhere in the country. The fifth item, they're proposing stricter rules for uncapped or disused bores. So the only response that we can give to that is that will form the basis of ongoing policy discussions. So that's something that we will get into and look at. So, well, how could we improve those? What needs to be improved? It's not clear to us at the moment what that looks like, but that's something that we will look at. The sixth item is our compliance monitoring and the need for physical monitoring of active and disused bores. And so that's bores that are currently in use, or ones that might be unused or abandoned. So this is something again that we've started on. We started on some time before the report came out to put in place some processes to start this work. Recognising that we have about 8,000 bores in our register in the region, so it's quite a large task. We've triaged our approach, so we've effectively said in the areas immediately around the registered drinking water supply bores, that those are the areas that we're starting in. What we've done is we've contacted in writing all the landowners and asked them to specifically come back to us and confirm that they meet wellhead security bore integrity requirements, to tell us whether the bores whether they're still in use, whether our location, our understanding of where they are is accurate, or whether they have bores on the property that we are unaware of or have been abandoned. That's turning out to be quite a big task, as I said. So in the first round we sent out 310 letters. We've had a relatively low response rate, about 26% so far. What we have said in the letter as well is if we don't hear back from people, we will need to put people on site to check ourselves. So if we don't get a higher rate of return, that's going to mean that we'll need a lot more warm bodies in the building to get out and start doing this work, to walk the landscape to check these bores. It's probably, in terms of the list of issues, it's probably the largest in terms of operational requirements, and maybe the largest in terms of how we need to staff ourselves in the future. This exercise is a bit of a pilot, so we can see how is it going to work. Is it having the impact and the effect that we want, or do we need to take a different approach, which might be not writing to them but actually physically inspecting ourselves? So all of those things we're working through. What I would point out though is that it's likely that it will be something that we'll be flagging up to you through the LTP for more resourcing for, and it may be that we need to come back to you urgently fairly soon in the new financial year for unbudgeted expenditure to deal with this. But we don't have a full picture on that just yet, but it's something that you'll expect to hear more of very, very soon. So the 7th item relates to the item we've just discussed, so I don't need to traverse that again. The 8th item they've suggested is the grazing of sheep and other permitted activities may well need to be regulated in the future through our regional plan, and I know that's something that James is aware of, and it's something that will no doubt be addressed and dealt with through the tank process and any other policy reform that we have on the go. And the final one is that we will need a seamless notification processes so that the respective organisations, the District Health Board and ourselves, the District Health Board and the District Council are aware of resource consents that we're receiving that may be relevant to their interests as drinking water suppliers. So again, something that we had identified early in the process. I would point out that for well over a decade, this council has advised both the DHB and the Hastings District Council, including their drinking water supply team, of any consent coming into the building, just the same way that we send you emails every week. They've been getting that for well over a decade. But we see we can improve on how we deliver that in terms of the context that goes with it, and that probably the joint working group that has been convened in response to issue 8 to the inquiry excuse me, is the right vehicle for that, and would, that would represent a greater level of engagement rather than relying on people reading emails. It would be a flagging it or raising it to them type of process. And again, that's going to be a bit iterative in terms of what works best for all parties, but we're open and very receptive to improving that. The only thing I'll flag up is that it does present for us some challenges down the track whereby parties may perceive they are or should be considered affected parties for a resource consent process, but our policy or the law doesn't support that position. So we may have to resolve those. Ideally, we'll resolve them through dialogue and discussion with the parties, but it may be that we need, again, policy reform to address those if we think they're significant. So that's probably enough talking from me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ian, is there any intention to do further science work to prove or disprove this theory and conclusion that the aquifer may have been contaminated from the Mangaterrituri stream or other surface water courses as compared with being sucked in through defective boreheads?
So we're not proposing to do any more physical testing of the bores. What is happening, and I've put these slides up simply because I thought, well, I suspect that the aquifer might be a point of discussion. If I can find my mouse, there it is. So bore 1 has been effectively abandoned. That's the advice we're getting from the District Council. They have no intention to use bore 1, and it is suspected that bore 1 is the bore that was the primary mechanism by which water was drawn in from the Mangaterrituri stream. My mouse keeps disappearing. Bore 2 is not being used, but may in future be. Bore 3 is still active and has had a reasonable amount of investment in terms of treatment added to it. What we are doing in partnership with the District Council is looking at some further tracer dye tests, particularly in the tomato mushrooms area and in this ephemeral stream, to try and understand whether there is a connection from any of these areas to bore 3, and therefore does that raise or elevate risks, notwithstanding that the bores have what they call log 5 treatment, which is treatment sufficient you could take water out of the Waikato and drink it after treatment. So it has a high level of treatment, but nonetheless, we see value and we're working with the District Council to better understand the linkages of and the behaviour of surface and groundwater in this area. And it may well be that bore 2 in the future is brought online, so therefore testing in the relationship with bore 2 may be something that we're considering. And I've put these slides up just to remind you, this is a slide that we prepared for the public meetings, and it has been presented to you numerous times, that in the course of this exercise, on 3 rounds over 3 months, we extensively tested the aquifer and found no faecal contamination in the aquifer in any area around bores 1, 2 and 3. So these green dots here are where we sampled. It's not all of them, it's just the view that you get from Google Earth here. And as you can see, a bore immediately up gradient in terms of groundwater flow, and within a few tens of metres of bore 1 consistently tested clear. So this has indicated to us is that the contamination has been localised to bore 1, and that it's been a result of the drawdown from pumping of the bores. And I think I've got some other photos here that show you. So that was the one I was referring to. Other neighbouring bores that have tested clear. Just here. So this is what they have colloquially now called the pond. So there's a road culvert there which is perched and has a result of creating a pond here when this rainfall water builds up there.
But actually that one bore that was clear is closer.
Yes. Yep. That's a private bore. Well, actually, was that a private bore? Don't quote me. I think that's a private bore. This is a bore. This was actually a bore that we discovered that was one that was drilled by the Borough Council in its day when they were exploring for water before they got to bores 1 and 2.
The one on the right pumping as well?
This one, no.
No, the one on the right, other one.
This one here,
Yeah.
intermittently, so that's a domestic supply, it's a household supply, which had total coliforms, total coliforms are vegetative matter, breakdown of leaves, decay, that sort of thing, and that represents probably poor bore maintenance. Maybe the bore hasn't been cleaned, I suspect, since it's been put in. The screens are probably dirty, but no faecal contamination, so no pathogen.
You know, they put in the dye in.
Yeah.
From the pond.
Yeah.
Did all those wells get the dye coming up in them?
One of these, I think, one of these domestic supplies ended up with dye, because it didn't in the first round. It did in the second round because we put an enormous amount of dye in. Because in the first round of tracer dye testing, it was inconclusive. But the advice of the experts was that wasn't enough dye used, so there was an enormous amount of dye put in, and it's possible that so we haven't drawn anything into the fact that it turned up there, simply
How
because
deep is that well?
it's reasonably shallow, and also reflecting that we know it has total coliforms and it may well have integrity issues, so it may well have a perforated
When you say
casing.
relatively shallow, do you know how deep?
No, not off the top of my head. No, sorry, but not to the depth that these other bores are.
But they're not deep either.
Well, these ones are, bore 1 particularly isn't deep. It's
No.
screened at about 11.5 metres and goes down to about 22 metres. Bore 3's screened at about 20 odd metres and goes to 30 metres. So they're not deep. The average depth of bores across the Heretaunga Plain is 30 metres. So they're not.
But
none of
everyone
these are deep.
who's putting a bore down now, no one goes less than 60.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, what the inquiry said is that when you start pumping this bore, it creates what they call a cone of depression, and that's not something you need Prozac for, but it draws water into a cone, so it effectively brings it down towards the screens on the bore, creates what looks like an ice cream cone, if you like, and in doing that, it creates a preferential flow path, or it draws water in from the surrounding area. And what's happened, or has been and has either happened in this incident or has been happening for a long time, and we will never know that, is that the water here, mouse is gone, water here is being drawn down through the bottom of the stream through the gravels into the aquifer and then across into bore one.
And that's what the panel said.
That's what the panel said.
That's
And-
their favoured option.
That's their favoured option, and that's the area that we've been criticised for in consenting the bore in 2008, that in their view, that's something that engages the RMA because the action of
Yeah.
this bore has a localised effect through contaminating groundwater and is something that we should have been addressed. And like I say, represents a significant practice change for the sector. It's not something that we have done or do.
Is there any way that we would or could have known that that's what's happening?
Well, our view is no. We had both the district council engaged independent, competent groundwater advice from a man by the name of Dr. Mark Giapari, who also gave evidence to the inquiry. Mark's evidence, which was corroborated by our experts, said that what's happening with bore one is that it's intercepting groundwater as it flows in this direction and is depressurising the springs that exist along here in the Mangateritiri stream, because from about here the Mangateritiri stream permanently has water and it's fed by spring flow, so water coming up out of the ground. He was saying, and it was agreed to by all of the experts, that this is capturing some of that water and depressurising the springs, so lowering the rate of flow. There was no indication in front of the decision maker at the time that there was a direct connection to the surface, because obviously if there was, the district council would have said, well, okay, clearly we need to treat the water.
But isn't it true, didn't Nikki challenge the granting of that consent on those grounds?
So Nikki challenged, along with other parties, not just Nikki, but other parties challenged the granting or the proposal for the consent, or all of these consents, on the basis that it was having what we call a stream depletion effect. So it was intercepting the spring flow and reducing the amount of water flowing down the stream in the summer. And there was an agreement reached between a side agreement, not an agreement in law, not an agreement that's relevant to us, a side agreement reached with the District Council and Ngāti Kaurana Iwi Incorporated to, by 2018, when these consents expire, to have migrated away from these sites to an alternative site.
Just that one or all of them?
All of them.
So that side agreement still theoretically stands?
And is a matter for the District Council to resolve with Nikki.
So effectively, the aquifer is not a confined aquifer, and essentially it's been known for some time that that is the case?
Well, that's the finding of the inquiry, that certainly the aquifer is not confined. Again, at the stage of consenting these bores, it had been considered and was, on the basis of expert advice, confined to semi-confined, so it had some confinement, but was not ever considered to be unconfined. And there's been all sorts of views on this throughout the inquiry and various opinions on whether it is or it isn't. In the evidence in front of the decision maker in 2008, it was clear that there was some confinement of all of these bores and that it was intercepting the spring flow and not drawing in surface water directly.
But if it's stream depleting, then that implies that it's unconfined, or it's linked to those streams.
It's what you would call semi-confined. Like I say, it's because it's stream depleting, because it's not as we understood it. It was not drawing the water in directly from the surface. It was intercepting water, so the groundwater flows roughly in this direction here. It was intercepting some of that water before it had the chance to come out here in the springs. So it was capturing it and taking it away for drinking water supply before it got to the springs, therefore depleting the flow of the springs here, not drawing it directly in from the surface. That was the understanding in 2008.
Point of order, Chair. Why are we relitigating the inquiry's findings? I gain no benefit from it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I believe that I've got a right to ask the questions that I have. And the question has been answered. Thank you.
Can we have some light on the matter?
Yeah, I was going to say, should we kill this?
Yes. Excuse the pun. Yeah. Yeah, when I speak, when I speak, the lights come on. Thanks, Ian. I've just got a couple of questions to do with the immediate consequence of the inquiry finding, and you've indicated some remedial step or actions to be taken. My first questions relate to the immediate consequence of the finding that groundwater is finding its way into the aquifer, and as a result, the surrounding bores to the water, the water supply take come into play, if you like. So it's actually a follow-on from that question: confined, unconfined. With all of the water supply, water takes throughout the Hastings district here, what is the immediate action of this council to ensuring their security?
So you're talking about the bores other than the Brookvale
Well,
bores?
we now have the prospect, given the findings, whether we agree with them or not,
Yeah.
that what we assume to be a substantial confinement of the aquifer and the take, we now have the prospect that they are substantially unconfined and at risk. Have we undertaken, one, an assessment of all the water takes for freshwater supply, and two, have we, and I note the self-reporting from surrounding points, possible points of contamination, have we got water security now as a result of this finding?
So Hastings District are treating all of their network, so all of their supplies are now treated.
Well, perhaps just put that to the side.
Yeah. So can I guarantee you, have we got security of supply for all those bores? No, I can't. What we are doing is, through the joint working group, it's already flagged up through the district council's own water age studies that there are issues that are either relevant to their bores or broadly for the aquifer, because they've found young water in places where they haven't in the past. So that's already flagged to them, and it flagged to them some time ago that there are potentially some issues that they're working on. We're working with them through the joint working group to understand. So to say, well, does that need to change the way we've looked at the aquifer? Does it change the way that their bores are operated? And we don't have clarity on that, but that's an active piece of work at the moment between the parties. Now, we are also, have done our own aquifer-wide study, and obviously you're aware we've invested an enormous amount of money into the Heritonga aquifer generally in terms of our understanding for the model development. That's going to help us understand whether areas that we thought were previously confined are now semi-confined. That hasn't concluded, but it's an active body of work at the moment.
So you're not seeing the need for any immediate remedial action on surrounding bores, which by implication could potentially be contamination points, given this new science that's emerged,
And
that risks are there.
And look, it's a good question, so I follow now what you're asking. So do we need to go and look at all of the irrigation takes, for example, and see whether they're drawing in contamination of groundwater?
All those drinking water takes.
Well, but I think it's much broader than that. I think the effect of any abstraction potentially has an effect. And this is the point that we're saying is a significant practice change, and what we're wanting to understand, given that these aren't recommendations, is that how we should be reacting, or is that what the RMA, is that what is anticipated by the RMA and that we should be doing? Because that's an enormous piece of work if we were to go out and trace it, test all of those bores. And that's something that we won't do on our own. We would do that collaboratively with the district council to say, how real is this? How do we need to respond to this? So it's an area that that will no doubt be the subject of much discussion through the joint working group. The district council, like I say, at this point, are aware of this. or this phenomenon, let's call it, and are obviously treating their entire network. So as I understand it, they're comfortable with any risk elements, notwithstanding that we'll need to, in the future, either do a bit of work, or quite a bit of work, to understand the impacts of their bore pumping, or the inquiry may say, actually, no, that's not what we meant you needed to do, this is what we meant you needed to do. So we need to work through that.
Councillor Bevan?
Thanks, Chair. Are you aware of how many bores there are in total in the Hastings water supply, and whether these are, where these sit in relation to others in terms of the shallowness of them?
The answer is a qualified yes. So we have a well store database which has, like I say, about 8,000 records in it. So that,
I'm talking about water supply for Hastings.
oh, sorry, of their bores. Do we have details of their bores? Yes, we do.
So where do these ones sit in terms of their relative shallowness compared with the others?
The Brookvale ones, they're very much at the shallower end. Portsmouth, Wilson, and Omahu, I think, are the other shallow areas, and those are the ones that have all shown up young groundwater recently in the testing. But otherwise, most of
Is that telling us something?
well, and we're not sort of jumping to conclusions. What we're trying to do is sift through all of the information to say, well, why is that happening? Like I say, we've got our own aquifer-wide study that GNS has done for us, and we're waiting for the reporting of that. And then we're going to sit down with the District Council and their experts and our team and work through it and say, what does this mean? What's it telling us? And therefore, how do we need to react or respond to it? At the moment, it's not clear.
Councillor Bialy?
Thank you, Chair. Ian, thanks for the report. I'm pleased with the way that you've responded to the questions or the comments that are coming out of the inquiry. There's a couple of things that interest me specifically. I mean, broaden it from the actual water inquiry to, I think, it's maybe policies and processes that we've got internally here around the way that consents, applications for resource consents are taken through in terms of, I mean, the comment you make in your email was about HBRC may not rely on information submitted by the applicant. Broadening that out to not only consents for water takes or anything else like that, but all consents that are applied for through the regional council, and similarly the issue about the monitoring of consents on an ongoing basis for all consents, be they for water takes or whatever. I'm just concerned that there may be other risks to the council in terms of, are we ensuring that we are doing our utmost to monitor different issues or different parts or different consents that may be out there in environmental terms. I'm specifically thinking of a couple, for example, the discharges to the atmosphere by PanPac, the Onikawa landfall issue here in Napier, and the Royce Hall landfall over in Gimblett Road, or over State Highway 50. Have we got a sufficiently robust monitoring program around those issues to deal with those if they don't come back and bite us? So, I mean, I know it's perhaps not an issue that's going to be dealt with through here, but is that something that you are considering as part of this process in the long term?
So yeah, two points to that. So good question. In terms of consenting and relying on information provided by the applicant, the reality is that we do, and I don't see that changing for us quickly, simply because it makes sense that if you've got what we would as the regulator consider a reliable, reputable, competent professional advising the applicant, as occurred in 2008, we would have no reason to say, hey, look, we don't believe you and we want to go and do our own work. And typically there's staff internally who review that, or we may get an external review of the advice given to the applicant just to test it. But if we get to the point of saying, hey, look, this man or woman is top of their game and the advice they're giving the decision maker as well as the applicant is robust, then it makes sense that we rely on that. If it's contestable information, or we don't believe it, or we have doubts about the competency of the individual, we'll go and get our own, and we do that as a matter of course. I can't respond specifically to those 3 consents, but I'm happy to bring back more detail in the future. But absolutely what it's done is honed the thinking around our risk-based approach to compliance monitoring. It will see a significant step change, I believe, throughout the sector. And again, our practice of a risk-based approach is consistent with the sector's approach. It's consistent with the Productivity Commission's recommendation to regulators generally, that we should take a risk-based approach. We shouldn't monitor every condition of every consent every year. You don't have to. What that means in practice for drinking water in particular is an area that's obviously going to receive a great deal of focus through stage 2, because evidently we can do better, and we will. And then obviously the spin out, as you say, to other discharges or other consents that may be higher risk will be front and centre for the resource use team to say, are there things that we may have taken for granted or relied on the competency of the applicant or the consent holder that we no longer feel that we can? Because obviously in this case, dealing with a territorial authority, there's a degree of respect and understanding of their competency and ability to do their work, which may be different if it was an unknown business operation. So all of that will have to be worked out.
Just to make it clear, I don't expect you to come back and report on those 3 particular
Okay.
cases, but it's just, to me, that's as you say, looking at the whole risk-based thing in terms of the monitoring, which is where I'm interested to make sure that you don't just focus in on the drinking water. It's the broader approach for all your resource consents that we hold. So to see that you're looking at doing that, I'm happy with that. Thanks.
Are there questions?
Yes, one of the questions the inquiry raised was about the cooperation or the relationship between the councils. And someone's made a comment just recently, which I thought was really pertinent, is that a lot of the expertise rests here in this regional council. A lot of the operational responsibility rests with the Hastings District Council. And it seems to me that the cost of all of this is paid by the same person, the ratepayer. But yet we seem to think it's regional council, district council. So have you given any thought to some sort of merging, interoperability, ongoing pooling of the resources of the staff which are in here with the Hastings District Council staff, and so we have some sort of joint committee which overviews, sees these things, so that all elements have the same visibility, and Hastings District has access to our staff's expertise and knowledge, and we have access to what their staff's knowledge and expertise is, and what they intend to do. Have you thought of, has that been given some consideration to that?
Yeah, and it is a good question, and I'm happy to say I was surprised that the panel was very definitive around describing our relationship as dysfunctional, because I've never had a problem with dealing with Hastings District Council staff. Where I see your concept playing out in reality is through the joint working group, which is already in place. So the joint working group is a collection of the technical, the operational people around drinking water safety, involves our science manager, consents manager and myself, and involves their 3 waters team. What we've done historically with those, them is, look, we've had chats, coffee, engaged, discussed, but we've never had a focus on this, and that's a failing. That's what we haven't done. So we haven't had a group like this joint working group that has had an absolute focus on an outcome being, absolute reliable public drinking water supplies. But the joint working group now reflects that, and I think that's a model that could be used to spin out into other areas. And already the joint working groups sort of proving a fertile ground to have, as you say, we've got a bunch of science resources and a bunch of knowledge they don't. Well, how can we use that better? How could we collaborate on that? And that's becoming reality through that process.
Councillor.
Another question, if I may. It's on a completely different track. One of the issues was that the bores required some time ago a new consent. The initial response for this council was that they didn't agree with that. There was some discussion between the 2 councils, and then the consent was, granted. It seems to me that in that process there are some issues for us to understand. How did this happen? What were the issues that caused the regional council to say, well, we were reluctant to grant this or don't. Then there was a change of mind. What I'm concerned about is that it seems that what were the processes that enabled that shift around to happen, and are we going to ensure that that doesn't happen again? It seems to me there was a bit of muddled thinking going on there. Consequence of which is what we're faced with today.
Yeah, so in 2008, I wasn't involved in 2008, but the recommendation from staff was that what the district council was asking for was going to have a more than minor effect on the environment through its stream depletion, and that there should be some reining in of what was being asked for, and through an iterative consent process that occurred. The point that I think the inquiry has made very clearly is that the focus was absolutely on the stream depletion effects and the quantity discussion, but scant regard for the quality, as in, will this have an impact on, albeit a very localised impact on groundwater quality? And that's the bit that all parties missed.
That's my question. That's my question. Is that having missed that, are we going to be in a position to ensure that we don't miss it again?
And that was the bit that I sort of said earlier, is that represents quite a significant practice change, as in considering the effect of an activity on itself. And we're not saying that we shouldn't or we should. What we're saying to that, what we would like to do is go back to the inquiry through stage 2 to sort of just unpack that and say, well, here's what that means in practice. Here's how do we deal with that? How does that work? Is that the intention of the Act? Recognising, like I say, that if we took a literal interpretation of that, it won't just be for drinking water supplies, it'll be for any irrigation take, and it represents quite a significant body of work, not only for this council but the applicants, and it may result in many consents being recommended to be declined, i.e. because they're going to impact groundwater. Now that's all good and possible and may be the final outcome, but we want to understand whether that's the right outcome, I guess, and is that what should happen. So it is front of mind.
Chair, perhaps can I add, because I think there's an additional element that the councillor has raised, which we haven't quite touched on. Last night in our meeting with the senior executive of the Hastings District Council, we discussed, rather than the past practice of us essentially sitting as a regulator waiting passively for an application to come in for the drinking supply from the Hastings District Council or any other TA, and then discharging our responsibilities around the effects, is prior to that us working around their strategy longer term around their assets. So understanding what is their replacement cycle, where are they proposing to go over time, what are their needs as the community grows, so that we have an early conversation about their infrastructure development and what issues that might give rise to, whether it's public health or environmental issues, so that before we get into a consenting process such as what happened in 2008, there's been a lot of dialogue between the two councils about what needs to be achieved and what are the outcomes that we're working towards, so that we don't get into essentially an adversarial situation as I guess we did in 2008. And so there's a high level of agreement between senior staff of both councils. That's the space we want to get to.
Could I just finish with one last question? So I just noticed that you mentioned, Ian, about the law and about the process. Yeah, that's in my mind well and good, but what we have to be focused on, for me, is the outcome. Yep. And I just want to make sure that we don't get ourselves bogged into what the law or the process says. I want to be assured that the council's got its mind clearly fixed on the outcome, and that we deliver the best result. So that's what's imperative to me, and I'm just making sure that hopefully you've got that, your team have got that in mind as well.
Absolutely, and again, reflecting the discussion we had with the District Council senior executive last night, that's exactly the common view, is that the outcome we want is safe drinking water.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up. I had one question, but now after this discussion I've got two.
Make them succinct.
They will be very succinct, Mr. Chair. You've outlined a raft of measures, 9 I think, but I'm not seeing amongst them a critical element that goes with, I appreciate we need to love our neighbours and hold them dearly. But in Theodore Roosevelt's words, speak softly and carry a big stick. I'm not seeing the development of not a stick, but a club here, so that we can ultimately demand compliance from our dear neighbours.
So, yes, your observation is correct, and what I've just focused on is the inquiry's kind of thinking. There still remains I call it the elephant in the room, because my team feels it the most, this tension between us being a regulator and being a part of the community and working with people, and how we balance that, and how we get the right outcomes from consent applicants or consent holders, but at the same time have an absolute firm and decisive bottom line around taking action when it's needed. So I haven't got it here. We haven't given any specific thought to it, and I don't have an answer for you, but it is something that we are contemplating and will no doubt be more reflected or better reflected as this conversation carries on.
And the second question, if you indulge, Mr. Chair, is in regard to the creationist science we now have in play. Do you think the self-reporting from the surrounding landowners and consent holders to be sufficient in terms of reporting the quality of their bores and or their uncapped or unidentified takes from that surrounds? Is our approach in terms of writing a letter sufficient to guarantee that, given the state of play?
Again, a very good question, and the answer is I don't know, but what was said is we'll start with this, and we've started with a relatively small catchment of 310, and we're going to see out of this exercise whether this is effective or not, and if it isn't, we may need to come back, and I've signalled to you, we may need to come back and say, sorry, but we're going to need half a dozen people to do this work over the next 5 years.
So if I could follow up with a question on that. If we're going to have to bear a significantly heavier burden of monitoring and perhaps auditing and so forth, particularly for these commercial users, would we not be fair to expect that we would have 100% cost recovery for that? We're giving them access to a free good that, on the other hand, we are expected to be guaranteeing the security of and the quality of and so forth. Would it not be a cost recovery issue for us?
So we do run a cost recovery model for the compliance team. So they've got to recover 70% of their costs, and generally do. But there is an element of public good, private gain in that. So the council's current policy is a 70-30 split in terms of the cost recovery. We're very open to looking at how we can cost recover this so that the cost of this is borne by those creating the management response. I don't believe at the moment we've got a particularly good model for us to do that effectively, and that would be something that, out of, like I say, this pilot, if there's a need for greater resourcing, either immediately in the next annual plan or further into the long-term plan, you'll come back with a package of here's what we need and here are the options we see for funding it, including cost recovery, and then it'll over to you folk to decide what you want to do.
So we need to bring this to a close. The email and the memo that you prepared, can we treat this as public information
Absolutely.
to help explain what we're up to? So that's clear? Yep. Okay. Would someone move accepting this report? No? Okay. Last chance to comment if you wish.
No.
Okay. Any other comments? Cool. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. Thank you, Ian. We're going to have to take a break and then move into the biodiversity issue quickly, and we have a guest, I think, at 11 as part of that, don't we? Yeah. Okay. So let's only 10 minutes, come back at less than 10 minutes, quarter of.